Nice to see you, Cass.
Yes, good to see you as well.
Let's begin our chat today by acknowledging that we are on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and pay our respects to elders past, present, as well as emerging leaders.
Thank you. So, to the Coral Sea and its landscapes, and through the eyes of two palynologists.
But relax, everyone, there are no pollen diagrams.
It's probably worth noting, though, that the pollen records from this region are overwhelmingly from islands and of Holocene age.
And given the nature of the Holocene, there are a few major drivers of landscape change in this region. Sea level rise, Enso in the monsoon, and people.
So this is our region of interest and the locations of the most representative sites.
Some of these studies are better resolved than others, so how about we focus on those, but provide a resource document to everyone that lists all the stars on our map.
Good. So where to start?
Torres Strait.
Perfect.
This is a diverse collection of islands. Do we have records from all across the area?
Not all across. Our data comes mainly from the Western Group Islands, with pockets of information from the Northern and Eastern groups. The Western Islands are actually the high remaining peaks of the one-time land bridge, and we have a combination of inland and coastal swamp investigations, as well as data from an archaeological sequence.
Were you able to capture anything from the land bridge phase?
Yes, we know freshwater lowland dune swamps were present from before the Holocene. These were quite diverse landscape features, so set within a more widespread eucalypt forest. The swamps themselves supported a monsoonal forest type of vegetation, things like Melaleuca, Pandanus, and quite a herb understory.
But then mangroves established during the drowning of the Torres Strait Plain and expanded to replace these low-lying terrestrial environments. Do you see the so-called big swamp phase?
Yes. Rhizophora forests dominated from 6,000 years ago, and not until after 4,000 did their extent really start to decline. With shifts in things like sedimentation and the lowering of sea level, Rhizophora became just one part of a more varied mangrove system. And towards the late Holocene, pronounced mangrove zonation was quite common and eventually fringed by mudflats. Basically, this is what we see today.
Did the dune swamps return as sea level stabilised?
Good thought. Lowland dune swamps did re-establish, but they're more estuarine than freshwater, and they are not quite as diverse as the early Holocene swamps.
What about freshwater wetlands?
Well, importantly, inland freshwater swamps developed within smaller depressions as well as larger basins, but only within the last 2,500 years. And also in the late Holocene, we see changes from forest to open woodland, and this is with quite an expanded grass cover. Monsoonal forests became more restricted, and overall there's less diversity in the understory.
Would you say fire had a role?
Fire activity increases over time, particularly in the late Holocene, but in three quite distinct steps. So one at 3,000 years ago, 1,000, and within the last 750 years. This increase in fire played quite an important role in shaping that inland island space.
I'm curious about your inclusion of the rock shelter analysis. Do you feel you gained more insight into the drivers of landscape dynamics with the inclusion of this sequence?
The rock shelter allows for the localised vegetation change to be matched directly against known phases of that site use. And from there, any similar vegetation patterns and their timing can be correlated off-site, so to elsewhere on the island. From what we know from Ian's discussions, for example, this really has helped shown when and how Torres Strait Islanders incorporated inland environments and not just the coastal margins. I think this is an important takeaway finding.
Where to next?
How about another island?
Lizard?
Sure.
There are a lot of similarities between the Western Torres Strait Islands and what we call Lizard Island, which is in Dingle country. For one, they are all continental islands and were once connected to the Australian landmass.
Also, pollen cores at both locations have captured fragments of that late Pleistocene, early Holocene freshwater lowlands, and that's prior to marine transgression and becoming mangrove environments.
Although these areas on Lizard Island appear to be wetter than in the Torres Strait, given the greater proportion and diversity of palms found in the Watson Bay record.
That's really the only landscape record from Lizard Island.
And it's really the only suitable location. So it's worth noting that Simon Haberley, Laura Waywick and Faley Hoff are working on new material collected in 2018 from the same system.
And what we know already is that overall the establishment of mangrove forest follows that same general pattern for the region, maintaining that close relationship to Holocene mean sea level.
Lizard Island does differ, though, in that a major disturbance hits the mangroves, possibly a cyclone around 6,000 years ago.
And we can deduce the severity of this cyclone from the mangrove record, and thanks to John Greenrod's foundational work at places like Princess Charlotte Bay in the 1980s.
Yeah, John's work really is the pollen interpretive standard through which much of our regional mangrove history is understood, especially with regard to coastal succession and, of course, climatic and geomorphic conditions.
Yes, that big pulse of sand from inland erosion at around 6,000 in the Watson Bay record is a standout feature of that island's paleo environment.
Mainly because it prevented what would have been the classic landward progression and diversification of the mangrove system that usually accompanies the fall of sea level to present levels, starting around 2,000 years ago in this part of the world.
Yep, conditions just became too fresh as that sand pulse placed the system above its optimum tidal flow, really just putting that rhizophorous system under too much stress.
And a little pollen note of interest, we know how stressed the mangroves were as a number of the pollen grains are really deformed.
So a loss of a potentially good resource zone for people, although this did also allow for the expansion and the re-establishment of the lowland palm swamps, a habitat not seen since the early Holocene.
What about other landscape indicators?
Well, in a glimpse from the early Holocene, there's a transition from grassland dominance towards greater mixed woodlands, and fire accompanied this woody biomass.
And I guess wetter climatic conditions mid-Holocene might have suppressed the burning potential of the interior if it wasn't for that cyclone event.
True, but it's really the last 3,000 years that vegetation fire characteristics are patchier across the island.
That's right. Uli Proska found that 3,000 years ago and again from 1,500 years ago, fire frequencies increased, and the record shows abundant disturbance indicators.
Indicators like ferns?
Yep, ferns, but also herbs such as Asteraceae or daisies.
And accompanied by a decline and ultimately local extinction of certain rainforest taxa. Late Holocene climates are less stable and drier, but also it's not too clear what human interactions are contained within these signals.
There's also the issue that the late Holocene is rather compressed in the 2009 Watson Bay record.
And I guess this late Holocene story of biodiversity change and fire will be better resolved by the new course taken by Simon, Laura and Faley further inland.
But within the same Watson Bay system.
Should also be interesting given that planned pairing of the pollen with ancient DNA.
So going forward, it looks like there'll be a refinement of the paleoecological work and greater cross-correlation with the archaeology.
So we've talked a lot about islands so far. What about the mainland?
Well, I guess one of the best places where we have both inland records and coastal records, looking at that crossover between landscape change and human presence in the Cape, would be the sites around Weepow, where we have both worked with the Pepin and Wathine communities.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique landscape with those incredible shell mounds that first appear in the mid-Holocene, but really peak around 2,500 to 2,000 years ago.
And there are, of course, the less attention-grabbing earth mounds that also become more common from the late Holocene through to the present.
It's also great that within this cultural landscape, we have a good transect of paleoecological sites that run adjacent to the mounds, from Big Willem on the plateau the headwater swamps of Bellevue and Running Creek, and the mangroves on Embley River.
Not forgetting Pine River Swamp to the north of the Mission River.
So a really cohesive landscape story from quite a network of sites across this location.
Yes, and like other records from further afield, the early Holocene initiation of Big Willem Swamp was in a much older depression that had been exposed by Pleistocene aridity.
So are you referring here to the John Lully record from 3/4 Mile Lake on the southeast coast?
Yes, so in both cases, that is Big Willem and 3/4 Mile Lake, there are very tentative beginnings, just really moist, inundated soils and then very shallow swamp until the late Holocene. And that's when you get deeper and more permanent water bodies of today.
So there's an early phase of establishment and a later phase of deeper water at Big Willem. But what happens in between?
Good point. There appears to be a period of much lower sedimentation, almost a hiatus from around 5,000 to 2,500 years ago in Big Willem, and also Pine River Swamp further to the north. And it's not until after 2,500 that sedimentation resumes, and there is vegetation indicative of a much wetter landscape.
And this is also when Little Willem and the Bellevue Creek Headwater Swamp are initiated.
Yes, but once again, as with the Torres Strait records, we don't get a shift to a wetter eucalypt community in the dryland vegetation. But interestingly, there's a wet fern forest at the base of the Bellevue Creek sequence, and Vicky Miller found this in her master's work.
And if you travel further down this creek line to the mangroves, you'll find that up until the last couple of thousand years, the shoreline here was an open estuarine system, and that the thick mangrove forests you see today were only established in the last 500 years or so, with increased sedimentation and lateral extension out into the main channel.
Yep, and all these landscape changes have some pretty intriguing overlaps with the local archaeology, don't they?
Yeah, they sure do. They seem to suggest that, at least on Wathain country, that although some shell mounds first appear the mid-Holocene, the bulk were built in the late Holocene.
True, there's an early date at 6,000 and a very late age at 150 years ago, but the bulk accumulated during that 500-year window and overlaps with a landscape becoming much wetter.
So declining shell mounds don't actually signal people leaving the landscape, though, as the earth mounds become more common.
Yes, and these have a strong association with freshwater creek lines and were used right up until European colonisation and after. Importantly, these creeks, which developed in the last 2,000 years, never run dry, even during extreme years.
Well, on that, it would be good to hear from Sarah Slater later today and hear about her proposed work on the nearby Quockenham shell mounds and some of the environmental data that's planned to be recovered from those.
What about fire in this landscape though, Cassie? Emma Wren did some additional work to our original study.
All the results are very consistent, which is good, and reveal, perhaps not unexpectedly, that burning occurs throughout the record from Big Willem, but that there are two shifts in fire activity, and one at 1,000 years ago and then again within the last century.
So could this be a record of that transfer to intense late dry season fires with Europeans moving into the region?
Yes, it certainly looks that way.
It's not strictly in the Coral Sea flagship region, but if we step a little bit further to the west, the work done on the Wellesley Island group is another good example of bringing together archaeology and paleoecology to reveal quite a unique data signature.
So are you talking about the time the Kaidak people had to leave Betnik Island following a cyclone in the 1940s?
Yes, people leaving the island led to vegetation thickening and large wildfires, which are captured in the environmental record.
But then subsequent resettlement in the 1960s brought about fire management back to the island, and large events disappeared as the vegetation opened back up.
Yep. So another island record that captures an extreme event, but also a record that captures that dynamic between people, fire, and vegetation cover.
You know, thinking on that, we have far less paleoecological insight into PNG's coastlines and lowlands compared to the highland regions.
Yes, by comparison, long-term land and plant use are also less well known.
Some people don't actually realise that PNG's central province includes areas of savanna vegetation, and that these exist as outliers of the savannas widespread across Cape York Peninsula.
Oh, so remnants of the last glacial and that much wider geographic range.
Yes, that's right. So ecologically, this savanna shares many traits with the northern Australian sclerophyll vegetation, and its climate is also similar, if not even the same.
But a different human history.
Yes, that's the one. So landscape use incorporated shifting cultivation and with a differential use of fire in field plot rotations.
Plus, we know from Pacific Island records that the arrival of lapita pottery leads to transformation of landscapes.
Yes, and this will be the interesting comparison to explore against Northern Australia, and valuable also for the archaeology research for us to provide not only a terrestrial dryland but a coastal shoreline context.
How have investigations started?
We've 2 studies so far from Caution Bay, one coastal and one in the savanna hinterland, and it's a similar story to the ones presented, but one more recent.
So still linked to that fall in sea level to present levels?
Yes, yeah. So Rhizophorus colonised only about 2,000 years ago, and from there established into a dense forest by about 1,300 years. It appears to have initially dominated right up that tidal profile and bordered that dryland forest.
But then a shift occurred at around 1,000 years ago. Do you know why?
Well, the theory is that the embayment was quite slowly raised, such that the upper tidal zone favouring an Abyssinia then developed. And following this, mangrove's most landward edge became mudflats, and these are far more widespread than we see in other regions.
So at no stage since the mid-Holocene did Caution Bay include long-term or widespread rainforest vegetation?
No. The closest that we see is the coastal thickets from the late Holocene. More so, the landscape shifted in its woodland formation, and the strongest of these shifts being 3,000 years ago.
And what about fire?
Well, charcoal concentrations are initially low, so burning had little influence until those frequencies increased, and that began in this same 3,000 to 2,500 timing. And this rose even further within the past 1,500 years.
So a noticeable co-occurrence.
Yeah. So frequent fire appears to have interrupted the regrowth pattern from those typical pioneer species, and instead encouraged a shift to a more grassy woodland. And the pandanus in some lower lying swamping areas also increased.
And so I guess you have plans to try and tease out the human component in these changes.
Yes, that's the plan, very much so. So the coastal records that we have all are quite consistent story, and it's associated with the slowing of sea level rise in the mid-Holocene, the development of mangrove forests dominated by Rhizophora, with these forests becoming more complex and more species rich over time.
And these estuarine and mangrove habitats were also really important and productive places for people.
I love the consistency between the few, and there are only a few, inland sites as well, especially the 2 phases of wetting up that we see. So that first one in the early Holocene during the warm wet time when the monsoon is considered at its peak, and the ITCZ in a southward position.
And then we have those drying trends in the mid-Holocene before the swamps become these larger bodies of more permanent water in the late Holocene.
This is likely a reflection of enso conditions and intensifying from 4,000 to 2,000 years ago.
and then weakening, leading to that to those strengthened monsoon conditions.
And so that strengthening of the monsoon in the latter part of the Holocene has a real imprint in these sites.
Yes, across this region and beyond, we have the same direction of change, although the intensity changes with location, especially if we consider those records beyond the region of interest to the flagships, such as the Atherton sites and the fabulous work you and others have done at Girraween and several of the other top-end sites.
But there is still that increased variability in ENSO that seems to have led to a dryland vegetation of increasing openness and a landscape far more capable of carrying fire.
Really contrasting to that earlier part of the Holocene where monsoonal rainforest elements were more common and not so restricted to the small pockets that they are today.
And we have two locations with really strong imprints of people and landscape interacting. And there I'm referring to the Weeper and the Becknick records, both showing the potential of this kind of data for the flagship generally.
Oh, grief. It's time to sign off. Time is up, as they say. It's been so good to chat.
Yeah, it really has. Thanks, Janelle. Until next time.